We are living in a radical liberal post-Biden dystopia. The entire nation has been impoverished by his backward economic policies. Meanwhile, crime is rampant because the border has been opened to the criminally insane, pouring unchecked into our country. Cities have burned and our precious pets are being eaten. This is Biden and Harris's America. Look, I get it. It's a presidential election, the stakes are high. An important strategy of every political campaign is to focus on the shortcomings of the existing administration. Sometimes this even includes exaggerating some of the worst elements of the existing administration to make them seem worse than they really are. This is standard running against the incumbent 101 kind of politics. It's effective because presidencies are often complex and dynamic. Even our best presidents have made consequential mistakes. Remember when you couldn't turn on the television or sign on to social media without hearing about Benghazi or missing emails or, to be fair, the Russia conspiracy porn that was constant on MSNBC for the opening years of the previous administration? Look, this stuff is to be expected, and each voter must decide how much weight to give this rhetoric. But the apocalyptic dystopian fetish of the right takes our previous experience with this tactic and amps it up with gamma-irradiated steroids from hell. The standard rhetorical flourishes of previous campaigns have now been distorted to the point of absurdity. Absurdity that a disquieting number of our citizens seem to believe. If a Martian were listening to the right-wing media today, they would be confused. They would think that the United States were a Mad Max-style hellscape traversed by roving gangs of pet-eating psychopaths. Of course, we're not. As we go about our everyday lives, the simple truth is that the country doesn't look like what is portrayed by the mouth-frothing right. On any given day, most of us wake up in our secure homes. Our pets are perfectly happy. We go to work. We go to the store. We hang out with friends. We find our Amazon deliveries at our doorstep. Maybe we get stuck in traffic. Maybe we're paying a little more at the grocery store. Or our rent is shot up. Or our homeowner's insurance is insane. This sucks, but for the most part, our lives are perfectly normal, just as they've been since the end of World War II. Then we turn on Fox News or scroll through social media. The country is going to hell in a handbasket. Everything is burning. You can't walk down the streets anymore without getting murdered or raped. We need to abandon everything we believe in about rights and freedom and democracy and put a strong man in charge who'll steamroll all of those people who want nothing more than the collapse of American civilization. Only then will America be great again. Are you even living in the same reality as the rest of us? I mean, yeah, bacon's a little more expensive and my mortgage is higher than I like, but don't you think you might be overreacting? So I figured I would dedicate this episode of Mad Sociologist in the News to take an honest look at our current dystopia and ask the question, is it really that bad? And if it's not really that bad, why are so many millions of us convinced that it is? Let's take a look. The right wing supports its dystopian fetish with three interrelated pillars of the liberal apocalypse: the state of the economy, the prevalence of crime, and unrestrained immigration. So I'm going to take a look at each in turn. When looking at the economy, my instinct, my visceral response is to inundate you with a bunch of charts and graphs because I love charts and graphs. All right. Sheesh. I won't inundate you with charts and graphs. Maybe a couple charts and graphs. I will, however, include a link to my fellow charts and graphs-ophiles below. If the economy were the Mad Max hellscape claimed by the right, then we should see that in measures of GDP. Here we go. Oh, there it is. There's the collapse of the American economy right there. Oh, no. Wait, that took place during the previous administration. Then it looks like it shot back up and continued to grow under the Biden administration. Let's be clear. There's nothing the previous president could have done to prevent the COVID recession. Either the economy was going to slow down because we shut down non-essential businesses and sent non-essential workers home, or would have shut down because those workers became too sick to work and even died. What we are seeing in this chart is a standard V-shaped recession curve. The economy collapsed because of a global pandemic. The government significantly increased deficit spending to provide relief and stimulus to the citizens, and the economy rebounded with sharp initial growth, slowing to more sustainable growth thereafter. It's a standard Keynesian model. Wait, Keynes? He's a communist. Our guy would never do Keynes stuff. Yeah, so look, I've been criticized because my videos run a little long. So from now on, when parenthetical stuff like this comes up, I'll do a separate explainer that you can access in the links below. It's clear that the kind of apocalyptic economic collapse that plays on right-wing social media simply didn't happen. It's not real. If you want more evidence, check out the charts and graphs Ophilia link. That brings us, of course, to inflation. The central critique of the Biden administration has centered not around growth, but around inflation. Inflation is out of control. It's the worst inflation we've ever seen. All because of Biden's inflationary policies. Why does Harris hate America? Okay. Prices have increased substantially, and this deserves attention. Here's what inflation looks like according to the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index. I'm using this because it is the measure used by the Fed to track inflation. There are others, and they overlap almost exactly. Again, I'll include them in the link below. You can see that inflation did, in fact, shoot up under Biden, but has since come down to almost what it was before the pandemic. This was a very real crisis that happened under Biden's watch. Now, it's important to understand Biden and his policies did not cause this spike in inflation. We know this because every nation in the world experienced the same kind of inflationary spike. It was simple law of supply and demand. During the pandemic, supply was cut as production was shut down. Once the risks of the virus were mitigated, people started to go back to work, but the economy did not return to normal. All that spending that people put off during the pandemic became what economists call pent-up demand. They had money to spend, and they wanted to spend it. But businesses rely on global supply chains. It took a while before these global supply chains could meet the elevated demand for increasing supply. We had the perfect storm of skyrocketing demand and stagnant supply. That being said, inflation does cause serious hardships, especially when it comes to necessities like food, housing, and gas. That Biden didn't cause this inflation does not defray the fact that he was expected to do something about it when it comes to inflation. That's never good, because the standard options available to deal with inflation are really unpleasant. There are three strategies. First, do nothing, so long as inflation is not entrenched. In other words, future earnings and spending estimates are not based on a prediction of high inflation, then the increased prices should incentivize investment in those sectors. More investment means increased supply. Increased supply should ultimately stabilize prices. Yeah, do nothing is not a popular strategy for a politician to take during a crisis. We've come to expect our leaders to do something when faced with a crisis. The next solution is called contractionary fiscal policy. This is when the government dramatically increases taxes and just as dramatically decreases government benefits and pay. The resulting surplus is then withheld by the Treasury, unavailable for people to spend. The goal is to drag down demand to meet the capacity to supply. Imagine if Biden came out and said, hey guys, I'm going to raise your taxes and cut your government service while laying off thousands of federal employees. We'd eat his liver. The last option is outside of the president's control. It's called tight monetary policy. In this case, the Federal Reserve raises interest rates and reserve requirements to increase the cost of borrowing. This slows investment and thus slows the economy down. Again, the goal is to depress demand. As the economy slows, inflation comes down. Usually, this involves creating a recession. The last time the U.S. experienced high inflation, then Fed Chairman Paul Volcker drove up interest rates, cut the legs out from under the economy, and caused the recession of the early 80s. It was bad, and millions of Americans suffered. But it worked. Many contemporary economists felt the same strategy was necessary for a current inflationary crisis. Larry Summers suggested that unemployment would have to be increased to around 10% for a couple of years before inflation came down. That really would have been bad. Imagine Biden's critics if the Summers strategy were employed. So how did Biden do? And I say this with the caveat that there's very little that a president can do about inflation. Well, Biden did not raise taxes and cut spending. Indeed, he increased spending on infrastructure and green technology, which has been a huge benefit to many communities, disproportionately communities in conservative districts. He didn't exactly take a do-nothing approach either. He did put resources into expanding ports, negotiated lower drug costs, increased the number of oil leases to bring down the price of gas. There were a lot of executive actions, some more significant than others. What has been labeled Bidenomics emphasizes investments in infrastructure and manufacturing, support for labor, and pro-competition antitrust policies. This is not contractionary fiscal policy. The rest was left to the Fed. The Fed incrementally raised interest rates. The goal was to create a soft landing. In other words, they wanted to bring down inflation without causing a recession. Well, how did it work? Well, as you can see from the chart, inflation is back down almost to normal and we didn't have a recession. On the other hand, prices are still higher than they were before the pandemic, and this is a source of understandable anger among many people who don't have a background in economics. The truth is, it will take some time before we start to feel an equilibrium between our income and our expenditures. Overall, we got through this crisis relatively well. It sucked. Don't get me wrong, it sucked. But it could have been much worse, and for many countries, it was. In fact, by any measure, the United States bounced back from inflation better than any other advanced country. Look, economic crises happen, and they don't turn around right away. We can't expect any president to snap his fingers and make the situation better. That's not how economic crises work. So then why do people think the economy is so bad? Well, that's a complicated phenomenon, and there are a lot of explanations that you can find. For my part, I think there are a few overlapping explanations. First, a significant number of Americans are getting their news from sources that are promoting the economic apocalypse discourse, regardless of the facts. And many such people are not looking elsewhere for alternative perspectives. If all you hear is how bad the economy is doing, that's what you're likely to believe. But shouldn't they be able to tell from real-life experience? Well, many of them do. Research on this indicates that for years, many people feel personally secure financially, but still believe that the economy is a disaster. That being said, I'm not particularly comfortable with the whole everything is fine, everybody is just unaware discourse that is perpetuated by many pundits on the liberal center. There are real issues that are of significant concern to many Americans. First, inflation has come down, but it hasn't reversed. A 2.5% increase is still an increase and is especially painful when it's coming on top of a 7% increase. I've written about this on my Mr. Andocious Classroom page. I'll share the link below. Now, it's actually a good thing that prices haven't fallen because that only happens when you have a recession, and nobody wants a recession. On the other hand, higher prices are higher prices, and nobody wants higher prices. The failure here is that at the outset of this crisis, the administration should have communicated the realistic goals for reducing inflation. People expected prices to return to what they were before the pandemic. That was never going to happen. As an aside, I think this is part of a larger issue with the liberal center. Liberals underestimate people's ability to grasp policy details and just expect the electorate to just trust the experts. Liberals do a piss-poor job communicating to average people, and this comes off as arrogant. Another problem is economic precarity. People may be in real numbers better off than they were 4 years ago, but that does little to assuage the sense of insecurity that people feel about the economy. For the last 50 years, people have lived under what's called neoliberalism. Neoliberalism focuses on the creation of wealth by allowing investors to advance their own well-being by any means necessary. At the same time, neoliberalism incentivizes wealthy investors by disempowering the vast majority of people, cutting social safety nets, privatizing public goods, disempowering unions. Neoliberalism perpetuates and even thrives on the economic precarity of working people. Consequently, anybody over the age of 30 years old has, in the last 15 years, experienced one of the worst economic recessions in our nation's history. The wealthy got bailed out, but average Americans were left on the side of the road. They then slogged through a long, slow recovery. Just as they were getting on their feet, the pandemic hit. Then inflation. Meanwhile, well-paying jobs have been lost through offshoring, downsizing, and automation. Now artificial intelligence is reshaping the economic landscape in ways we can't even predict. This may not be an economic apocalypse, but it's not an economic utopia either. We are living in economically unstable times, and most Americans do not have reserve resources to sustain themselves when the economy falls apart. And most Americans expect the economy to fall apart at any time. No amount of data is going to change that perception because most Americans are one crisis away from economic ruin. And when that happens, the government has demonstrated that it will leave them hanging. In the meantime, inequality has been rising since 1968, and though it dipped slightly in the last few years, it's still high and obnoxiously noticeable when the wealthy are literally taking pleasure rides into space while their employees are peeing in bottles to make their work quotas. Once thriving working class communities have been ransacked by globalization. Racial minorities and women have made some notable gains, but this is in relation to very low bars. The reality is that the economic security of almost all Americans has not grown in conjunction with that of the overall economy. And we all know it. And this is a motivating factor for many people on the right and the left. On the other hand, these are long-term trends. They're not specific to Biden. They are not an indication of the kind of economic wasteland being decried by the political right. This is just run-of-the-mill neoliberalism that we've been dealing with since the 70s. Yeah, but we all know that violent crime is out of control in Biden's America. Just going outside is taking your life into your own hands, especially in those Democrat cities. It's funny. I was sitting in a garage waiting room waiting for my car to get a tire fix. A guy sat down beside me and was watching the news. The anchor was reviewing the latest FBI crime numbers and noted that most crimes are down significantly. The guy next to me responded, that's bullshit. It's not. Again, here are the numbers. We did experience a brief uptick of violent crime toward the end of the pandemic. Much of the increase happened during the previous administration. This was totally predictable by sociologists. It's a situation called anomie, or a breakdown in norms and values. In this case, it was a response to the dissociations caused by social distancing and the stresses of the pandemic. As the pandemic ebbed, norms and values were restored. Crime, including violent crime, is down to what it was before the pandemic, which are historically low numbers. In fact, crime has been pretty stable for over 30 years. Now, this is nothing new. I've been studying sociology for almost 30 years, and in that time, people's perceptions of crime have never conformed to the realities. People just assume that crime is so much higher than it was when they were kids. It's simply not true. If you're 40 years old or older, crime rates were much higher when you were outside playing than they are now. Back when I was a kid, major movies included Mad Max and Escape from New York, Death Wish, movies that capitalized on real crime waves and the perception that criminals were taking over the streets and would soon rule. Yet our parents didn't hesitate to send us out on our own without supervision. And we ended up just fine. Didn't we? Of course, back then, we didn't have a 24-hour news cycle with a profit-raking, if it bleeds, it leads mentality, inundating us with bad news all the time. Today, we can't turn on the TV or go on social media without becoming privy to the most macabre stories from around the country, creating the impression that everyone's neighborhood is chock full of serial killers. The fact is that in most places in the country, you're safe. Yes, there are pockets of crime, regions where you're more likely to be victimized. This has always been true. And no, those pockets of crime do not correspond with Democrat cities. When you map out crime prevalence, the biggest correlation is those places that have been the most devastated by neoliberalism, regardless of the governing party. These are places with cities with high concentrations of poverty, overlapping with high drug use and high gun ownership. Again, this is nothing new and hardly specific to Biden's America. Yeah, but what about all those mentally deranged illegal aliens pouring unchecked over the border, eating our pets? Oh my God. Oh, Jesus. Okay. So for years now, media outlets across the spectrum have been reporting on the crisis at the border. The fact is that yes, during the Biden administration, we did see record numbers of migrants at the southern border trying to enter the United States without going through the legal process. In other words, they were undocumented immigrants. This has been framed as a crisis by both center liberals and the political right, and even by some on the political left. But how the crisis is being framed is significant. Those who see a crisis at the border frame the issue in one of two ways. The right defines the crisis at the border in terms of lots of those people trying to come into our country illegally, and this must be stopped. The most moderate of this perspective is that we can't just let people enter the country outside of the legal process. The more extreme perspective, however, is that those people are bad people bringing crime, drugs, and disease. The fascist right includes the whole poisoning the blood of our country mantra.
They're poisoning the blood of our country. That's what they've done. They poison mental institutions and prisons all over the world, not just in South America, not just the 3 or 4 countries that we think about, but all over the world. They're coming into our country from Africa, from Asia, all over the world. They're pouring into our country.
The solution, consistent with this frame, is to stop those people from getting across the border. We need walls and barriers and armed people who can stop this invasion of illegals who are coming here, killing us, raping us, and, of course, making a meal out of Fido and Mittens. They decry this administration's open border policies, allowing millions of criminals into our country. It should come as no surprise at this point that I'm going to call shenanigans on most of this frame. Yes, lots of people have crossed the border illegally, though the total amount peaked in 2023 and has since come down to what it was at the end of the previous administration. Suggesting that the Biden policies can be decried as open borders is belied by the fact that, according to the Department of Homeland Security, hundreds of thousands of undocumented immigrants have been turned away at the border during Biden's tenure, which means the borders are not open. Furthermore, fewer than 1% of the encounters at the border with undocumented immigrants involve migrants with a criminal background. Of those with a criminal background, the most common crime committed was trying to cross the border illegally. If at first you don't succeed, in fact, we know that crime rates among immigrants are lower than among natural-born citizens. Are there examples of undocumented immigrants committing crimes? Yeah, of course. You have any large enough demographic, you'll find examples of criminal behavior. But when news agencies focus on anecdotes of criminality without offering a broader view of the issue, that's data mining. That's propaganda. The alternate framing of this crisis is that the problem is structural. This is the frame many liberals and leftists take. The claim is that the United States has neglected immigration policy for decades. Consequently, it is virtually impossible for poor migrants to come to the United States legally. The legal process is daunting and can take dozens of years. Furthermore, there are simply not enough people to efficiently work in the asylum process. We need more immigration judges, caseworkers, lawyers to meet the needs of the border. This isn't just a matter of militarizing the border to keep those people out. It's a matter of having the resources to make the legal migration process work the way it's supposed to. According to Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, the broken system actually empowers smugglers and coyotes to take advantage of the massive asylum backlog. Quote, the smugglers know the system very well, and they're seeing an immigration court backlog only growing year over year. They're seeing the duration of immigration enforcement actions extending longer and longer, and they're able to coach intending immigrants that there's not a need to evade law enforcement. End quote. Once in the country, it'll be years before the asylum cases will receive any attention at all. The Biden administration has put some new practices into effect that may be contributing to the recent decline in border encounters. Among these has been working with Mexico to turn migrants back before reaching the border, empowering Border Patrol to make asylum decisions in real time, an app for asylum seekers to seek appointments at legitimate ports of entry, and other executive actions. But a real fix will require legislation. Legislation that has been written but has been shut down based on the Republican nominee's fear that it would hurt his campaign. We can contrast this with the previous administration, which literally used tear gas and violence to control the border, and even went so far as to rip babies from the arms of their mothers and loved ones and threw them into cages. Of course, if you define the crisis as one in which those people are a threat, then you might consider such extremist tactics legitimate. I do not. Look, there's never been a time when everything in the country was running smoothly. We have hundreds of millions of people representing thousands of cultures and different interests over a wide geographic area. There's never been a presidency in which there were no crises, no problems, no mistakes, no misdirected policies. Everything was fine. Indeed, throughout most of U.S. history, the challenges have been daunting. Sometimes very effective leaders have arisen and propelled our nation forward. Sometimes our leaders haven't been so great. Most times our leaders have done an uninspiring job. Nobody has ever gotten a perfect score unless you are certain people inclined to grade themselves on a curve. Our nation does face real problems. Millions of Americans are economically unstable and are negatively impacted by the changes taking place under neoliberalism. Economic inequality continues to plague us. Labor power has been curtailed and is struggling to make a comeback. Most significantly, the Earth's ecology is changing as global warming reaches crisis levels. Technological changes are disrupting our daily lives, and if that weren't bad enough, the freaking Nazis are back. These are big problems that seem impossible to resolve, but we've faced big problems before and have come out better for it. Doing so, however, required us to have a realistic understanding of the problems we face and a leadership that espouses reason and empathy in advancing solutions to our problems. As it stands, one strand of our polity, what historian Richard Hofstadter referred to as the paranoid, are not interested in reality, reason, or empathy. And this group has managed to take over one of our major political parties. As a consequence, we're seeing the rise of a major problem that we'll need to deal with before we can address our other concerns. Hate. Hate crimes since 2015, the year you know who came down the gaudy escalator, the number of recorded hate crimes in the United States has doubled. To what extent are the two phenomena related? Well, that's hard to say. One study by Karsten Mullert and Carlo Schwartz suggests that hateful online rhetoric may not increase the amount of hate in the population, but it appears to embolden those who do hate into action. In 2021, a far-right group known as the Oath Keepers claimed that they were awaiting direction from the former president before directing their violence. Another study revealed an increase in anti-Asian sentiments after the former president made his notorious Chinese virus claims. Remember Kung Flu? Brookings cited one study that shows an increase in anti-Asian hate incidents following this statement. The Southern Poverty Law Center has tracked over 1,400 hate and anti-government groups last year. In 2000, they were tracking just under 600. And yes, there are some left-wing extremist groups, but most political violence today is associated with right-wing groups, many of which are noted supporters of the former president. They also tend to be far more organized and structurally capable of directed violence. According to polls conducted by Public Religion Research Institute, the number of Americans embracing the legitimacy of political violence has been swinging from 16% to a high of 23%. Republicans are more than 2.5 times as likely to support this sentiment, and Republicans who express deep support for the former president are more likely still to believe violence may be necessary if the 2024 election does not go their way. I would point out that, as it stands, hateful action seems to be concentrated on one side of the political divide, but that won't last. If one side continues to threaten the safety of the other, it's easy to predict that at some point, the other side will try to even the battlefield. For the first time in 40 years, we've seen an attempted assassination against a high-level politician, and another attempt thwarted early. This is scary stuff, but it's not an indication of dystopian decay. Remember the instability of the 60s and early 70s, the assassination of President Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, MLK, Malcolm X, Harvey Milk. So far, our politics have not devolved to this level of violence. Yet. In sociology, we have a principle called the Thomas theorem. What people perceive to be real becomes real in its consequences. Now, this theorem is not typically applied to macro-level analysis. It's not intended to necessarily describe society as a whole. However, I don't think it's a stretch to predict that if enough people perceive that the nation is the dystopian nightmare in which hordes of those people constitute a threat, then they might be inclined to act in accordance with a Mad Max kind of world, and in doing so, create the very apocalyptic nightmare they decry. For the sake of our collective future, reasonable people, regardless of where we fall on the political spectrum, cannot allow this to happen. See, our pets are just fine. Although I'm seriously considering eating this one after I think I had to redo about 10 sections out of this video because he wouldn't stop barking.